Hello, and welcome to the second talk on race, justice, and policing in Edina. My name is Mark Felton, and I am the chair of this event. Last year, we focused on personal experiences of 4 individuals who either worked or lived in Edina. This year, we'll focus on implicit bias. The program will last 90 minutes. Today, our moderator is Dr. Aja King, psychologist and chair of the Brooklyn Park Human Rights Commission. Dr. King will introduce our speakers, the noted psychologist, Dr. Bravado, Garrett Akinsanya, and Edina's new police chief, Todd Milburn. After the presentations, Dr. King will moderate a Q&A session. We invite you, the audience, to participate in the Q&A by emailing your questions to hlee@edinamn.gov. The email address is also shown at the bottom of your screen. Dr. King will direct your questions to the speaker. Again, welcome, and I hope you find the event informative. At this point, I'll turn the program over to Dr. King to introduce our first speaker. Hello, Dr. King.
Hi.
Thank you for moderating this event.
Hope everybody can hear me well. Thank you. It is a pleasure to introduce our first presenter, the nationally recognized psychologist and speaker, Dr. Bravado Garrett Akinsanya, licensed both as a clinical psychologist and a clinical social worker. Dr. Garrett Akinsanya has worked for over 35 years in a variety of public and private mental health treatment settings. She has served clients all ages and trained students and mental health professionals seeking post-degree licensure. Welcome, Dr. Garrett Akinsanya.
To be here this afternoon. And I'm really excited about the opportunity to talk about issues around implicit bias and policing and our wellness as a community. I always like to start out by telling people about my name. My name, Bravado Garrett Akinsanya, is a lot to write on a check, but I like to tell people that my name, Bravado, was given to me by my mother, who was a school teacher. She had had 5 boys before she had me. So she was so happy to have a girl, she was gonna name me Brava, or Bravo, and she said, those kids may give my baby a clapping complex on the playground. So at that point, she decided, well, I'll think of something harder. And then she knew the word bravado. And bravado means bold, daring, and courageous. So she feminized it and called me Bravada. So now, I don't know if you know, there's a car called the Oldsmobile Bravada, and I say that that's my claim to fame, to have my name on the butt of a vehicle. So Bravada is the name I got from my mom. My name Garrett came from my father, Austin Garrett. My father was born in 1898. That's right, 1898. And my grandpa, Simon, was a child when slavery ended. So I keep that name Garrett to remind me that I'm only 2 generations from being a slave myself. My last name is from the Yoruba tribe in West Africa in Nigeria. And that name, Akinsanya, means recovery of strength and power. So you all, hopefully, by the time I finish talking, you'll know a little bit more about me. But I see myself as an African-American woman boldly recovering from slavery to regain my strength and power. So today, I will talk with that spirit of connection. I grew up also in a town called Floydada, Texas. A man named Floyd and his wife named Ada decided to make a town called Floydada. And it's only 4,000 people in Floydada. Most of them are white, so we're very little diversity. About 7 black families, about 4 Latinx families, no Asian families, no one of indigenous or Indian descent. So growing up in Florida, I learned a lot about what it meant to be in community, because it's a very rural community. Your nearest neighbor may be 2 miles down the road. So you learn that neighborhood and community isn't necessarily determined by proximity, it's determined by who you hold in your heart. So today as I talk to you, I'm talking to my extended community. And that's the spirit from which I come and the spirit from which I will be speaking. So I'm ready now for the first slide. Race, justice, and policing. Today we will talk a little bit more in remembering George Floyd, his buying cigarettes with a $20 bill while black, and what his life and his death symbolize for many of us who are in BIPOC communities that finally see people who aren't in our community can see and feel our pain. We learned through the many times and distances that there is a space in our communities where we have to draw the line, because when there's no justice, no one can be at peace. And when someone is oppressed, all of us continue to be. So today's training goals are going to be to invite you to explore trauma and that's caused by aversive racism and implicit bias. You'll also be invited to explore how trauma impacts community and policing. And finally, I hope that you will understand how community members can recognize this trauma and begin the process of healing. There's an African proverb that says, the axe forgets what the tree remembers. And the historical roots of racism and white privilege often are the things that those of us who have been victims of oppression remember. And in the field of trauma, we have moved from the concept of defining the person who has experienced the trauma as the problem. Now we ask the question, it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And so many of us don't know the history of people of different ethnicities or races in our communities. But today I'm going to share a little bit about the Black community and our history. First, I want to talk about the context in which I'm going to introduce this talk. Years ago, I decided to create a model around what it meant to experience abuse and power on a social cultural context. We know and recognize this wheel, this power and control wheel, as the one introduced in Duluth that is associated with domestic violence. So we know that in order to create a group of victims, these factors have to be in place: isolation, emotional abuse, sexual and physical abuse, economic abuse. We know, for example, in America, for every dollar a man makes, a woman makes 72 cents. But did you know that for every dollar a white person makes, a black person makes 62 cents? And we got a raise. This model also talks about using children in multiple settings, where the settings benefit from having them in juvenile justice, for example, special ed. We also are going to talk about threats as part of the abuse of power and control that happens on a social cultural level. We also will talk about using white, male, and American privilege. And those privileges, we know, are things we don't even know we have until they're threatened to be lost. Finally, are the constructs of intimidation. And intimidation often is supported by an abuse of power, whether knowingly or unknowingly. When we ask, for example, someone who is a recent refugee or immigrant to our community, who lives in your house? Give us all their names, their ages. Those are intimidating questions because people aren't sure if their papers are right, and they wonder what you're going to do with that information when you ask it. So this sociocultural factors of abuse of power and control is a model that I created years ago to talk about and explain the context in which these abuses take place. We know about the American Revolutionary War, and we think with great pride of how people stood up to those red coats and won our country back, but often we don't know that the first to die in the Boston Massacre on May 5th was a black man, Crispus Attucks. And what was really important is that he led a march to I call it the first Black Lives Matter march. He led a march to talk to British soldiers who had hit a child with the butt of a gun. And the protesters were throwing snowballs, rocks, sticks, when suddenly the British soldiers started shooting into the crowd, killing 5. The first to die in the fight for the American Revolution was Crispus Attucks, a black man. We also know about the Atlantic slave trade, where from 15th to the 19th century, those 400 years, slaves were taken from the continent of Africa because there was a labor shortage. We even know from our history that Native American people were at first utilized as slave labor by the Europeans until a large number of them died from overwork and diseases brought from the settlers. Then we saw a movement toward getting indentured servants. And what would happen with them is that as they would come to hire, they had to pay off or work off their labor. And what would happen is that if you break a teacup while you're washing dishes, the person who was hiring you or brought you in as an indentured servant or as an apprentice, they would charge you maybe a month or 2 for dropping a cup. And as you lived through that process, your debt never did get finished. Consequently, if you had children, your debt would be sent on to your children. The other thing they learned is that by the middle of the 17th century, all of the offspring of the indentured servants became property of their owners. We know now that current estimates are that about 12 million slaves were shipped across the Atlantic, although they say the actual number purchased by traders is considerably higher. We also know in our community learnings about our culture the idea of a guy named Willie Lynch, who talked about a foolproof method for controlling the slaves. And he guaranteed that for 300 years, if we would magnify differences, if we would create separation, use fear, distrust, and envy, show people someone being harmed, especially a black man and a woman. If they could show that to all the other slaves, they would be contained. We also learned that through that experience, they begin to see black people as deficit. Up in this drawing here that you're looking at the top is an example of this idea of black being dirty. You see the little black child step into the water for pearl soap to take a bath. And while he's there, he gets cleaned off, and look, when he gets out, he's suddenly white. And the implication, of course, is that being black is being dirty. So now that continues in our everyday experiences. We look at Rihanna before she became a star. We look at her after, being lighter and brighter. The same for Lady B, Beyonce, showing her Afrocentric looks and then getting lighter, even going blonde. All of this created a construct that was initiated in slavery, and that construct was called drapetomania. It was deemed a mental illness, and drapetomania was the problem of it. The diagnosis was based on the willingness or the desire of a slave to abscond from service, basically to run away. And what Samuel Cartwright, who brought this concept to the forefront, he said that it was started because slave masters were treating slaves like human beings. And when they treated them like human beings and equals, they had the desire to run away. They think they had rights. This same applies to the Indian community, where they say first they took our land, then they took our children. And here's a picture of Tom Tarlino Navajo as he appeared upon arrival in a Carlisle Indian school. And we know here in Minnesota, that and all here in the Northwest, many, many children who were Indian were taken from their families to be, let's say, contained and changed to be civilized. So that's what he looked like 3 years later. We also know that slaves were seen as 3/5 human, and they were often punished and sometimes killed. we even see the mark of the abolitionists. This was their logo. And it said, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And that's the question we're continuing to ask to this very day. As a psychologist, one of the first things I wanted to understand is what would make a human being to do something like that to another human being? Well, first, we know that by qualifying someone as less than human, that kind of gives you permission not to treat them as your brothers and sisters. So a concept called mentalcide. We've heard of suicide and homicide, even infanticide, but mentalcide is the process of systemically undermining and strip a person of their cultural values and beliefs through a process we call deracination, stripping their racial selves. And we use it through prolonged interrogations, drugs, torture, and it ends up being a brainwashing that allows one human being to abuse another mildly or extremely. And one example of mentalcide that turned to genocide was the post-Reconstruction of America in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as the Black Wall Street. This district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, had the most prosperous African-American communities in our country. But on May 31st of that year, the Tulsa Tribune reported that a black man, Dick Rowland, attempted to rape a white woman named Sarah Page. What happened and ensued after that were burning of their homes, rioting, killing, even dropping bombs in the community. And those blocks that were known as Black Wall Street were wiped off the face of the earth. It was 35 city blocks. They say 300 people died, 800 were injured, and it never rebuilt again. We know about Jim Crow. Now, I grew up in the South, as I said, and Jim Crow was the separation of people of color from others. I remember being a little black girl going into the school, finally going to school with white kids, because we had not been integrated, we were segregated, and people protesting because they didn't want to go to school with black people. That's kind of the way it went. That's the way it looked when the National Guard and children had to be escorted for fear of being murdered. This is the way it felt. This little cat goes, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And in his process, or her little process, she's hoping that she's in the sea of all these dogs, and she's hoping one of them will say, "Ho, don't mess with that one. Don't mess with that cat. That's my home cat. She's good people. Don't mess with that cat." And then she will have an ally in this hostile environment. I often talk about growing up in the South during Jim Crow, and I really didn't understand what it meant. I remember black kids had to we'd go to church and then go to the movies, and we always had to go up to the balcony. I thought that was because we preferred to be there. It was only later, as I grew older, that I noticed that we were required to be there, that we couldn't sit down on the main floor with white people. And every year in Florida, they would celebrate Floyd and Ada. And I remember being a little girl during Old Settlers Day, that's what they called it. And we'd all go down, Miss Ella would bring her hog around the Times Square that she got praised for at the county fair. The band would go around, the high school band would go around the one country square that we had. The city square had 2 stoplights and 2 stop signs, and they would just go around and around. And it was a special day. It was like a festival. So that day, I could read, and I remember it said restrooms, white and colored. And I asked my mother if I could go to the colored restroom. And I really didn't need to use it. She said, of course. So I ran to this colored restroom because I thought it was going to be purple and green and yellow and blue and orange. And I ran in as fast as I could. And I got in there. Everything was white. And I remember coming out and telling my mama, I said, Mama, those people lied. That bathroom is not colored. It's white, just like at home. And my mom looked at me and she said, baby, they're not talking about the bathroom. They're talking about you. And I still didn't get it because, children are so hopeful. I'd never seen purple commodes, but the next thing I saw were water fountains. One said colored, one said white. Now, in my cognitive schema, I didn't know what a purple commode would look like, but I knew a lot about colored water because we were indeed Kool-Aid kids. So I was headed for the colored water fountain, and there was a little white girl sitting there as well. And as she sat at that colored water fountain, stood at that colored water fountain. She was just about to turn the sprocket when her mother grabbed her hand and grabbed her arm and said, you cannot drink from that colored water fountain. Oh, the little girl had a fit. She said, but I want the colored water. I want the colored water. I want that colored water. So I knew it must be good because your parents never want you to have anything. So what I did is I looked around. I didn't see my mom. I ran to that colored water fountain and I turned the sprocket, and it was indeed clear. That's the day I remember learning that I was black. Back then they were saying, say it out loud, you're black and you're proud. That's the day I remember that colored was not good, that there had to be something wrong with me, that the white girl couldn't drink from the same water fountain as I. I started noticing around me, magic was okay unless it's black magic. Male was okay unless it's black male. And in our country, even a lie becomes all right if it's a white lie. So that psychological introject of being less than, faulty, flawed, bad, begin to take hold in my mind, my body, my spirit. And we see now how policy continues to separate white from black, poor from rich. I learned in my work that one of the things that happens is one of the byproducts of slavery was the right to exclude, the right to maintain rights of disposition over others, the right to status and reputation conferred by owning property or teams or people, and the right to use that property and maintain it for your own enjoyment. So then I think about Colin Kaepernick, and when he took that knee, because he was owned by someone else, it came with great, great, great loss for him and for the reasons he stood there. Because he could easily pass as white in many times or some other group instead of African American. He knew that being a black man was something that would be painful in this country. And he took a knee, not just for himself, but those who were targeted and harmed. So trauma is the experience of violence, victimization, including sexual abuse, physical abuse, it's severe neglect, loss, domestic violence, and witnessing violence. We know that there's forms of acute trauma that are right away, complex trauma that is multiple areas of our life that are composed of trauma. And it can come with delayed onset. It doesn't have to happen immediately. It can happen at least 6 months later or even years later when people experience the byproducts of trauma. So the next 3 slides I'm going to show you may hold content that's disturbing. So I would like to invite those who are really triggered by looking at traumatic scenes to take care of yourself. I will tell you when I go to the next slide. I will tell you when I come out of the next 3 slides. So 1, 2, 3. The next slide. Post-traumatic stress disorder is witnessing an event that involves death, injury, or something to someone else that you may or may not know. Because of social media, we could physically see the death of Philando Castile. We could see Tamir Rice as he was shot 2 seconds after the police car drove up, after holding a toy gun, playing with it in the park. And we all know from our own community the loss of George Floyd, and all of us being able to viscerally, and I said viscerally, and visually see his life leave his body. Post-traumatic stress disorder is also a threat to the physical integrity of another person. And the most important part of that is that when we have that threat, it creates fear in those who have seen it. If you bear witness, here is a picture of Charles Kinsey, who was a PCA worker for a young man who had autism spectrum disorder diagnosis. He was chasing this young white man around the street, up and down, trying to get him so he wouldn't run into the street with cars. And somebody called the police and said a black man is chasing a white boy up and down the street. And finally, when Mr. Kinsey caught the young man to stop him from running into the streets, by the time he did that, police were there, and he saw the police and said, "I'm trying to take care of my patient." The police didn't hear him. He had his hands up. He said, "Hands up." He put his hands up, and he still got shot. And then he asked the officer, "What happened? Why did you shoot me?" And the officer said, "I don't know. I don't know." So post-traumatic stress disorder also is the learning about an event that involves a death, injury, violent death, serious harm, or threat of death or harm to someone that we see in our family or other close associates. So because black folks have a sense of connection to each other, we're collectivists in our values, something happens to one of us, we all feel as if that is our extended family. So when Jordan Russell Davis was killed at the gas station for playing his music too loud by a customer, the thing that happened to him was that he died. And all of us were thinking, that could happen to my child. So we know that the core principles of trauma recovery services mean that one must go for safety. There must be a system that shows trustworthiness. People must be feeling that they have a choice. There must be a sense of collaboration and empowerment of community as being part of your community. There's a thing called post-traumatic growth that all of us, once we endure trauma, we can learn to appreciate life. We can improve our relationships with others. New possibilities in our lives, personal strength can develop, and spiritual change. And I use this slide in particular when I think about us as a community, those of us who live here in Minnesota, having to evaluate and take stock of our influence on others. We know that we have a background that's based in an exposure to adverse childhood experiences that may lend itself to us harming ourselves. We also know that our brain will work differently when we experience trauma. We know from years ago when we were studying, some of us psychology, we know that a man named Pavlov rang a bell and he would bring food until the bell and the food became an apparent association for the dog. Now that is the condition to which that police officer ended up killing that black man. Because in our systems, as I've shown you, black people are seen to be scary and just scary. So it influences our limbic system, which controls the way we feel and think. And it shuts down the prefrontal cortex of our brain that makes us make good decisions. We get into a flight, fright, freeze, or surrender stage. And when that happens, when people who are afraid of police start running, I want my police officers to be more trauma informed, to understand they're running from me because they're afraid. And they may not even be afraid of something that they've done, but I am the one who has a gun. And the other part is that all of us are recovering. Just like I said earlier, all of us are recovering from racism. And we're in a space where we have to understand that it's not just in the moment. Fear has been transferred from one generation to the next. And this trauma that we experience has been shown in research with mice who were given a shock every few moments. And after they were shocked, then they would smell, the sweet smell of cherry blossom would be put in the room. And when they smelled that cherry blossom, they would get shocked again. So they equated cherry blossom with the smell. With the experience of shock. What happened next was these mice, they mated with other mice. And when they had babies, the researchers piped the cherry blossom smell into the room. And what happened is the babies who had never been exposed to shock began to show the same reactions as their parent, their father, did when he was shocked. And this phenomena of experiencing viscerally epigenetics, that's right, epigenetics of the problem, went from 2 to 3 generations without them ever experiencing that shock and cherry blossom, but their body acted as if they did. And the reason some of us can't heal is because the shock does not quit. The shock of being a person of color or in a BIPOC community, that shock has not quit. So we can't heal because it doesn't stop. There's an African proverb as I get to the end. It says, "They who cannot dance will say the drum is bad." We hold aversive racism as a subtle racial behavior of any ethnic group who rationalize their aversion to a particular group. We have found that aversive racists profess egalitarian beliefs, and they have the motivation to change is only thought to be because it's implicit or subconscious in bias. They did a study looking at a white victim versus a black victim. And when there was only one white person seeing a black person choke, they would get up about 83% of the time. But when it was white person, they got up 78% of the time. But when it was two white folks, they would see a black person choking. And Dr. DeVito, who is a researcher who did this work on aversive racism, talked about it, and he said that the white persons both would get up about 75% of the time when the white person was choking, but they only got up about 33% of the time when it was a black person choking. And what he found is that when that happens, people would say, the reason I didn't get up for that black person was because I thought the other person would do it. But they didn't have the same explanation for the white victim. So this is implicit bias. Let me go to the end. What we found is that in our research, that black people are often perceived as apes. And in our society, apes are scary and dangerous. And we see here a little black monkey doll. She didn't come in white. They equated black person with monkeys. See, her name was Little Monkey. It says diapers for baby and monkey too. And here's a recent advertisement by H&M where they had a black boy wearing a t-shirt saying coolest monkey in the jungle, and the white bar, of course, he was the mangrove jungle survival expert. I have only one more minute, and I want to say this till I get to the end. That hate crimes mostly address people of color, that we're overly seen as criminal, and that here's an example from Hurricane Katrina. A black man was in the water. They said he was looting, but the same water had white people in it, and they were finding bread from the store. So we have a lot to overcome, and our culture tells us what to avoid, who to be afraid of, who to connect with. So I'm going to get to this end where I can get to that slide I'm trying to get to. Uh-oh, the sound's not on. So let me get to that. As I close, I want people to think about bearing witness. It implies that having seen at close hand vital events to which one has a moral obligation to testify. These events are often involve life and death issues, openness to the life of another, and the need to take compassionate action on others' behalf. Bearing witness informs, it declares, it testifies and vouches for an important truth. And that truth may be unpalatable. It may take courage to expose such a truth, and doing so may reflect on one's own character. So bearing witness may carry a sense of sacred mission. Something universal may be at stake, such as the presence of justice in the world. The truth that must be acknowledged, however difficult, that truth is ultimately for the sake of humanity.
And right now, white people are really frightened. If you don't understand the destruction of Planned Parenthood offices, and you don't understand the wall that we're going to build on the southern border of the United States, you haven't read the book, The Birth Dearth by Ben Wattenberg. Ben Wattenberg was a brilliant Jewish man who was a member of the American Enterprise Institute. And he wrote a book, the first paragraph of which says, "The main problem confronting the United States today is there aren't enough white babies being born in this country." He was an advisor to presidents of the United States. He wrote the book in 1987. He says if we don't change this and change it rapidly, white people will lose their numerical majority in this country, and this will no longer be a white man's land. Now, I'm not misrepresenting this. I'm telling you exactly, almost exactly what he says. He says there are three things we can do to solve this. Number one, we could pay women to have babies, as they have been doing in Western European nations for years. Then he says, and these are his words, not mine, unfortunately, we would have to pay women of all colors to have babies, so we don't want to do that. He says the second thing we could do is increase the number of legal immigrants that are allowed into this country every year. Then once again he says, unfortunately, the vast majority of those wanting to come to this country today are people of color, so we don't want to do that. The third thing he says, and women had better pay attention to this, 60% of the fetuses that are aborted every year are white. If we could keep that 60% alive, that would solve our birth dearth. Does that sound like racism to you?
Can you talk a little bit about the trauma associated with?
The trauma associated with it?
Yeah.
One of the main traumas is it tells white people that they are superior because of the lack of melanin in their skin. And then they find out suddenly that we've got a black president. That's traumatic. That's where the trauma is. Living a lie, finding out the truth, is traumatic. Finding out now, recently, that within 30 years, white people will be in the numerical minority in this country is going to be traumatic. White people are scared to death right now, particularly white males. They're scared to death that they are going to lose their power in the future. And they are. But if you want to get ready for the future, if you want to be treated well in the future, treat others well in the present. What we do in the present constructs the future. We called the Japanese, and you'll pardon me, but this is what we called them, slant-eyed little yellow We didn't say that about the Germans. After the war, we rebuilt Germany and Japan, and we get along beautifully with the Japanese. That was in 1945 that we finally won that war. How many years ago was that? Figure that out quickly.
I'm not a math person, but...
You're not a math person, but you know it wasn't that far.
Right.
And it didn't take 50 years for us to have peace with the Japanese and the Germans, even though we dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. The Japanese hadn't killed 10 million people. Nowhere near that. We didn't drop any bombs on Germany, any atomic bombs on Germany. They were a different kind of people. We couldn't afford to do that. We killed how many Japanese people with 2 atomic bombs? And they forgave us. You want to talk about forgiveness? You want to talk about changing this thing? I cannot understand how Japanese people can stand the sight of any of us, and yet they do. I cannot understand why black people who have been subjected to the ugliness that they've been subjected to in this country can get up every morning and go to work among us and not be absolutely furious. And I don't understand why we allow white people to behave the way they do. I don't understand that. And my third graders, after they'd gone through the exercise, couldn't understand it and wouldn't tolerate it. And when they went up to junior high and a junior high teacher used the N-word, one of my former students said, if you're going to use that word, I'm going to go out in the hall until you stop using it, because we don't use that word in this school. That was a 7th grader who told his teacher off. When we have enough students who are willing to confront people who are making racist, sexist, ageist, homophobic statements, we're going to be better off. We have got to stop tolerating the intolerable. If it's intolerable for my black cousins, and every black person on this earth is one of my cousins, if it's intolerable for them, it's intolerable for me. I will not tolerate it. I will not tolerate it. That is not that. I am required not to tolerate that kind of treatment for the people who are related to me. And that's every person on the face of the earth. If your ignorance is such that you'll mistreat somebody because of your ignorance about the color of their skin, don't do it around me. Number one, I've been threatened with death lots of times. Now I say, go for it, fool. My husband died 4 years ago. Being with him would not be a bad thing for me. Death is not the worst thing that can happen to you. Living a worthless, useless life is much worse than dying.
That's it. We have to use our lives for good. That's what this forum is about. Recognizing harm and stopping it. And with that, I say thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bravado. That was a wonderful presentation. You gave a lot of key points around the effects of racial trauma and how it creates PTSD, and how, as a society, we have to start to recognize how this has been ingrained within our society, the mixed messages, the underlying tones that we create within our media, within the way we interact in our policing and social structures. It's not that we can't get over it, and it's not that we can't move past it, but it takes the work of all of us. And that's exactly why we're here today in this conversation. So thank you so much, Dr. Bravado. I want to introduce our next speaker, Edina Police Chief Todd Milburn. Our next presenter is Edina Police Chief Todd Milburn, who began to work in Edina on August 16, 2021, following a distinguished career in Brooklyn Park from 1992 to 2021. Chief Milburn first served Brooklyn Park as a community service officer. After becoming a police officer in 1996, Chief Milburn served in a myriad of roles, including patrol officer, detective, drug task force undercover detective, SWAT officer, inspector commander, public information officer, and since 2014, deputy chief. Welcome, Chief Milburn.
Thank you, Dr. King. I appreciate the introduction. And it is true, I am the new chief for the city of Edina. I started here about 2 months ago. And I feel like I've been blessed to walk into this position and work for this city. I have had a number of years of experience from Brooklyn Park and had a great experience up there, which I think really helped set the foundation for me to move into this role. Moving forward here, what I'd like to do is share my screen as I talk here. And just a quick thumbs up if I could get from one of, Darren, could you give me a thumbs up if you see the screen? Okay, we're good.
Sorry, I don't see the chief. Not yet.
You don't? Okay. Okay, how about now? Okay, we're good. Thank you. Okay, and so what I'd like to do is just share a quick PowerPoint that I put together. We don't have too many slides here, but we're just going to update on a couple of things. The audience should know that my first assessment, or my initial assessment coming into this police department after only 2 months, has been excellent in that our staff here are phenomenal. Great staff here that work for this community, that work for this police department, that are doing excellent things here and have been for many years before I arrived. And so, again, it's been very impressive here to walk in the door and see that already in place. One of the things that we at the police department have done here is to put together some information about things that we have done, some tangible results, and some reporting out of some things that occurred from last year's event in the work around race and equity and a work plan that was created. And so there were a number of things that were put forward that were tasked for the police department to really complete and report out on. And so the first slide here that I want to show the audience are just a couple quick items here that we successfully implemented and put into play. One of the first line items here is called the implementation of the body-worn camera program. Not necessarily directly tied to the Race and Equity Work Plan, but one thing that was established and put into play about a year ago, and I just think it's important to point that out, that we do have body cameras on every officer that are out on our streets or patrolling the city. In addition to that, our body cameras are placed on our SWAT team members, so when they're out conducting that field of work, they also have body cameras on their uniforms as well. We've established and partaked in COVID, of course, put this on pause for a little bit, but we started to reestablish our community outreach programs. We have a program that's called our neighborhood enforcement officer that's out in the neighborhoods, engaging our neighborhoods and geographic areas, and we have officers specifically assigned to that work. They're working through patterns of crime, working with communities to understand what the root causes are, and understanding the other things that we can bring to the table to engage our community in different ways. We participated and established our Night to Unite event this year. Again, that was exciting to get out in the community members. And we have a very long list of different community outreach programs that we've partaked in the last year as we started to kind of reclaim and kind of get back to business here after on the back end of our COVID pandemic here, hopefully, as that hopefully starts to wind down here. More on that to come a little bit later here. One of the other tangible outcomes was the placing of our department policy manual on the city's website. That was a big important step to take to make sure that we had that information out and transparent and ready for everybody to take a look at if there were any questions out there. And we also removed the arrested party names from the crime reporting that was published on websites. I believe it was on a weekly or bi-weekly basis here, and so that has been removed as well. Additional outcomes, race and equity growth training has been established and has been ongoing for the last year. The majority of our officers have attended this training, and those that have not will be completing that by the end of the year. We've also participated in mandatory yearly training, which includes implicit bias. We all have implicit biases, so it's important to understand how to call those out and how to understand it and how to move forward. Crisis intervention, conflict management, and autism awareness are a few examples of that annual training. The training is extensive, much more extensive than this, but these are important to highlight for this audience. We also have been working through the starting point of what is called mandatory mental health program for all officers and dispatchers. And I'm just going to stop right there because I'm going to come back to that on the next slide. And lastly, on the slide here, you'll see social worker program. And that was initially established to have a part-time embedded social worker at the police department to help out in the community, to work the cases that were coming in on the back end. And we also shared that person, that part-time worker, with the city of Richfield. I'm going to highlight that here on the next slide as well. That's an update on the things that we've accomplished here in the last year since the last event, and let's look forward. What are we doing upcoming the end of this year into next year? So I put together a couple slides here to talk about projecting out into the future and things that we're working on. We mentioned and highlighted mental health and looking and supporting our officers, and what we're looking to do for next year is to expand that work in a more comprehensive way. Our officers are not going to be helpful out in the community if they are not in good physical and mental shape. And that research has really become more robust in the last 5 years. It is very important work in law enforcement that our officers are performing at a high level, but that they're also taking care of and they're understanding what's going on as they're also exposed to serious events that may happen in the communities that they serve, no different here in Edina. So as part of our wellness initiative, a couple quick highlights of things that we're going to look to build upon would be our physical fitness, working out on duty, more education around nutrition and eating correctly. Mental health, as highlighted on the previous slide, is very important, and we're going to start up a program that's called Check Up, Neck Up. And so that's going to allow, or actually have, I don't want to say force is the wrong term, but make sure that all of our officers attend what are called these Check Up, Neck Ups. And it's just a sit down with the therapist to understand and gain some information about what it is that we're being exposed to and how can we take care of ourselves, for lack of a better term, or just an easy way to sum it up. And if an officer needs some additional follow-up beyond that point, that's something that will be offered by the city as well, so that we can make sure that that officer is supported from the mental health aspect. Another example of our wellness initiative is just reporting out, or I should say educating on financial health. Those things are behavioral, and so if somebody is upside down on their finances, that's an indicator that there might be other things going on. And so by example, that would be something that we would educate and provide resources for our officers. So that's just an example or a snapshot of some of our upcoming comprehensive wellness initiatives that we're going to get into moving forward. Mental health response, I'm happy and pleased to say that we've been working with Hennepin County to increase our capacity to provide a full-time embedded social worker here for the police department and for the city of Edina. So that takes that half full-time, half dedicated personnel that we shared with the city of Richfield. It makes that a full-time worker for us here in Edina, Monday through Friday, and working through the back end of the cases. What we're also monitoring and we're working towards a goal in a couple of years is something that's called a community paramedic model. And there's a pilot that's going to set to occur here in Hennepin County with the city of Brooklyn Park that'll actually start to kind of bring officers back away from that response model. That puts more resources on the mental health side of things with our social workers and also perhaps our fire departments and the community paramedics within that framework to respond to those calls to reduce the police need, but also, you know, an officer showing up in a uniform can be pretty traumatic for people that are suffering mental health crises. And so having some different types of responses or tools for that, we think is a good way, an important way to move forward. So we're going to be monitoring that, and we're going to have an eye out towards that and hopefully embark on something similar to that in the city of Edina in about another year or two. Last slide for me, looking forward, again, just a couple other quick highlights, and these are important to the topic at hand here today. One thing I want to point out in police work is that, you know, oftentimes when we talk about the criminal justice system, our work, our police work, is occupied by responding to 911 calls and helping out residents in the community. And we oftentimes will be the pivot point to enter somebody into the criminal justice system, depending on the circumstances at hand. We have these moments in time in the timeline where we do have an impact and we can intercede and we can help out the disparity conversation here and also kind of help with the system framework. One example of that is juvenile diversion. For my previous city that I worked for, I developed out in concert with Hennepin County a diversion program that focused on youth and some of our more challenged neighborhoods. And when we started to look at data, we discovered that one of the things that were jumping out to us is that there was a large number of runaway kids, particularly in our female population. And we looked at that closely. We didn't realize that, but once we started to explore the data a little bit further, we decided that that's a good kind of a starting point for us to take a look at building out a program to capture runaways and catch them before they enter into other problem areas, committing crimes and things like that. This is just a quick example to showcase that the work that we can do to help kind of stop people from entering the criminal justice system, because kids in particular really need not to go in the criminal justice system, because we understand if we look at the data and the research that that can be a very negative impact for a child through their adolescent development. And so if there's some opportunities and ways that we from the police standpoint can jump in and help and kind of reduce that or stop that and redirect youth, by example, into some other programming, that's a better product for obviously for the child impacted, for the families, and for the community at whole. So we're going to be looking at doing some of those things here in the city of Edina over the next couple of years, take a look at our data and see how we can partner with our nearby law enforcement agencies and also Hennepin County to see what we can do, because Hennepin County is also a big stakeholder in this conversation, obviously, and they have a huge interest in this work. Next up, race and gender tracking. So we're going to take a look. We have been taking a look at that. We're going to put that into play. We're projecting out 2023. We're in the process of overhauling our records management system, our CAD information. That's just the computer software side of things, so that when our officers are out conducting traffic stops, that we're tracking that information. And for us to have transparent conversations in the communities, interacting with people, the questions that may come up, we need to have the answers to that. And so what is our data telling us? What are we doing? And if we have any problems, we need to call that out and make adjustments and move things forward. And so one of the intended purposes behind doing that is to get up to speed with that. There are a number of other cities around Hennepin County, by example, that are already doing this work. And so we're going to follow behind here real quick. Last thing, I'm going to turn it over to Officer Davis here. The last thing I want to talk about are recruitment strategies. Right now, as you probably know, it's very difficult in the metro area in particular to recruit candidates for law enforcement work. And so that's an ongoing challenge for us, but also diversifying police departments is another tall task for us as well. And so what I always tell my staff when I talk to people is I often say that we can't just wait for something to happen. It is what it is, but we have to move forward and find ways to be creative. But we also have to find ways to diversify our police department. In the metro area, as we all know, it's becoming more diverse, which is a great thing. Some cities are at a higher rate than others, but we also have to hire diversified candidates and future police officers to match with our population demographics as well. And so we in the city of Edina will be going through some significant recruitment strategies over the next year to try and bring in more diverse candidates here to diversify our police department. So I'm pleased to report out on that as well. I'll stop there because I want to be respectful of time here, but I'd also want to introduce our next speaker, Officer Darren Davis. We tried to change it up a little bit here today because we want to bring Darren in to just kind of speak from his perspective. He's been in our community now since 2016, and we want him to just come to the table and have a conversation or just kind of talk to us about what has it been like for him to be a police officer in the city of Edina, and how does he see things moving forward from his perspective. So Darren has been with us, like I said, for over 5 years. I don't know him very well. We've only known each other for a couple of weeks, but he's a great guy, great talent, highly respected here in our police department. So we're pleased to bring him on. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Officer Darren, or Officer Davis, sorry.
Thanks, Chief. Appreciate it. Hopefully you guys can hear me. So my name is Darren Davis, Jr. I want to first start out by just kind of giving a little background of who I am. I was born and raised in Chicagoland. Ended up coming out to Minnesota for school. My father was a police officer. My grandfather was a police officer. So I'm a third generation Black officer, followed in the footsteps of my grandfather and my father. I was blessed, lucky, whichever you would like to use, but I had the opportunity to learn from them and have a filter through the eyes of a Black male, not only a Black male, but a Black police officer. So watching what they did as I grew and became an adult kind of pushed me in this direction. And I followed their example because they taught me to have a value system in humanity and to lead by example. So as you can see on the slide here, I'm a part of a couple of different groups for the city and the police department. Most recently, I joined the Race and Equity Advancement Team, and I'm a part of the engagement aspect of that team. So I was given a couple of questions. The first question was, what's it like to serve in this community? Well, the one thing that I like about this community is that we have just about a little bit of everything. And I appreciate that because it gives you a kind of a wide scope as to different interactions you can have with different members of the community. What I do like about Edina is that our residents, they expect a high level of quality, and I was raised to provide a high level of quality. I like the work that I provide to be something that's valued, and I want that interaction that I have with that community member to be positive at the end of that interaction. Serving this community has been unique. I was for a long time the only Black officer with the city. The reason that I came to Edina, and I'll just state this now, I had never heard of the city prior to that. I had planned on actually going back to Rochester. I'll take a step back. Prior to being a police officer, I was a probation officer. And prior to that, I did a lot of social work, specifically with at-risk youth in the systems or at least in the communities that I worked in. So being a probation officer, I had the opportunity to not only see both the social work side of it, just seeing how the family system and the dynamics of not only the education system, the criminal justice system, and just life in general work, but I saw the court system and kind of how that worked. So as a probation officer, I prioritized trying to keep, well, everyone, but especially my Black and brown clients. I tried to prepare them. I would have maybe, for example, a 21-year-old client that made some mistakes. I would always explain to them that I'm more worried about or more focused about you as a 31-year-old as opposed to right now. What can I do to get you prepared for the future because things change? I did that for about three and a half years. And while working in that position, I interacted with law enforcement quite a bit. And prior to making the needed changes in my career to be eligible to become a police officer, I utilized the time as a probation officer to gain some of that experience. So in 2015, I decided to go back to school, and I went through the skills program, the academy, and luckily got hired with Edina. The person that recruited me was a sergeant at the time, who recommended Edina after I finished on my skills program. So luckily, I had the opportunity. I taught, I applied, and since being here, I've had multiple opportunities. It's been a great opportunity for me, and then it's been a great opportunity for the community because I'm able to start pushing some of the things that I value, along with the support from the community and the police department. So the second question I have here is, what do you see moving forward with race, equity, and policing in this community? Well, like the chief kind of touched on, and I know that that's my third question, what the chief touched on is within a police department, we want to have members of the police department that represent our community as a whole. And I think that comes down with education. And like I said, our current field is under scrutiny, rightfully so, but trying to explain to potential applicants like why this is a profession that should be valued, that is valued, and is necessary. I think that's where we have to start recruiting within the schools and starting getting out and interacting with our community more so than we have in the past. And with COVID and things like that, I know that slowed that process down, but I am one of those officers that are in the community trying to promote that change, which I think is very valuable and needed. My apologies. What challenges do I see regarding recruiting diverse candidates? As I just stated, it's very difficult to explain what this job entails without being able to have eyes on. What I try to do, I speak at community colleges and I speak at high schools. I try to explain just kind of the role that I took to get to this position and how I can provide some of that help if they're interested. Now, even having a grandfather and a father that were police officers, starting this profession when I did, I learned so much in that first year about just interacting with the community. Luckily, I had about 5 years of interacting with the community in a different aspect, but I think it comes down to, like I said, a value system and humanity. If you know how to speak to somebody, if you know how to meet somebody at the position where they're at, that interaction 99% of the time is going to be positive. No matter what, no matter how it starts, if you treat somebody with respect and understand that this person that you're dealing with is in probably the worst position that they're in their life currently, and you're the person there that's supposed to help change it or at least fix that problem. If you understand that, it makes it a lot easier and fulfilling to do this profession. Now, understanding that, and now trying to portray it to other young people, potentially high school or young college students, that's something that starts early. And just being able to get access to those areas, like potentially like high school or elementary or even in college, more so college, being able to share some of the real stories that I have and I've experienced and kind of pull some of those questions out of young people, I think that's probably the best way, well, initially the best way to start garnering maybe a potential response to the calling that we have here. I can't tell you how many times I've showed up on a call, I've seen a young person or I've seen a family see someone that looks just like them. And right away, the ease of that interaction, you can tell right away the nervousness goes down. They're a lot more open to sharing information with me, which, I do that with everyone, but specifically with our Black and Brown community, I've seen it. It's been extremely positive, which I want that to continue. But with that being said, I want more. I want high quality people that are invested in not only themselves, but the community that they serve, but invested in moving this profession in the direction that it needs to go, which is the right way, right? There's examples of what we need to do, what we need to change. We're very aware of that. But at the same time, we need to get good people that are invested in humanity in this profession. And I would like to start by leading by example and sharing my experience with potential candidates in the future. So I hope that answered those 3 questions.
All right. Thank you. Chief Milburn and Officer Davis gave a wonderful overview of how changes in policing can start to address some of the racial inequities that are occurring between policing and people of color, Black people more specifically. But Chief Milburn really emphasizing the importance of turning policy around when it comes to body cameras, having outreach programs, having trainings on implicit and explicit biases, even a social work program. And I personally love the mental health program, but that's just my bias because I am a therapist. But I think all of those things really help to speak to a holistic approach when it comes to policing and racial justice. And even Officer Davis speaking to programming and your experience within as a social worker. So you get to see the social economic sides and then the crossover and the connection, the bridge between policing and understanding the underlying issues that occur within the families and the communities that we serve. So all of those are important aspects when we are talking about building a healthier system around policing and racial justice and that healing process that it takes where all of us have to do our part, right? So at this time, speakers are available for questions. If you have a question, please email it to Heidi Lee at hlee@edinamn.gov. No spaces. So hlee@edinamn.gov. Heidi will provide those questions to the moderator, myself, to ask. Please be aware the panelists will not take questions that pertain to specific people or incidents that are currently being reviewed or investigated. So at this time, we want to take time to get some questions. All right, so I have a few questions here. Let's see. All right, this question is for the chief, Chief Milburn. How many traffic stops are performed every year? What is the objective of the stops? And how can citizens know if we're meeting those objectives?
Can you hear me okay? Okay. That's a great question. I don't have the data for how many traffic stops occur across the nation, and it varies from city to city. And I don't want to guess. So it kind of just depends. One of the second part of that question now is like, well, why are we doing traffic stops? What's the purpose behind that? And what I often tell people is that it's tied into public safety needs. And so our focus for our officers is to go out and conduct traffic stops that are tied back to that. What's the role and purpose of what we're doing out there? We're trying to make our roadways safer. So one good example that would be tied into that would be DWIs. I think we all agree that we need to have public safety around DWIs and reduce DWI offenders out there. And so for the city of Edina, for example, is heavy in traffic stops for DWI because we valued and prioritized that enforcement here for this community. And so that's one big reason why traffic stops are a thing here. The third part of that question, could you remind me, Dr. King, on what that one was, and then I'll answer that.
Yep, absolutely. So you talked about how many stops per year. What is the objectives of the stops, and how can citizens know if we're meeting those objectives?
Sure. So the last part of that, how do citizens know that we're meeting the objectives? That just gets into reporting out. And one of the things that I didn't talk about in the earlier presentation is that at some point here, we'll likely get ourselves into reporting out data information on our website. And so that goes back towards what are the needs, what's the data telling us, where are patterns of crimes, where are patterns of issues that we're trying to identify. And as the department goes through trying to enforce and trying to make things better, how are we reporting out on that? It's like a feedback loop back to the community. And so I think for the general public is how do I know, are we meeting those expectations? The onus is on us to report that information back out to the community in a way just like that.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. We're still taking questions. I have one for Dr. Bravado. You've talked about ways in which historical and modern day abuses have led to trauma among BIPOC communities. What are some ways that we could begin to heal the trauma?
Thank you for that question, Dr. King. I think there are a number of ways, and actually, as my brother Chief Todd Milburn was talking about a moment ago, the exercise of thoughtfulness when it comes to policing is one way that we would begin to heal. The fact that he talked about accountability in the system and expressed his own commitment to that degree of accountability is really, really important. The other thing that we have to do is recognize that we're all in recovery from racism, and that no one is exempt from that. And if we recognize that in ourselves as well as others, it'll be a lot easier for us to talk about race and talk about the impact of race on decision making and the impact of race in terms of how we engage with each other. When we get to that space, people will feel safer because of the honesty and the ability to empower each other through that honesty in that process. So that's my answer to that question.
Thank you so much. The accountability within the system in order to help to recover from such racism is so important. Everybody, for those who are still listening, send your questions into hlee@edinamn.gov. That's hlee@edinamn.gov. Chief Milburn, I have another question for you. We never want to see another incident like the one witnessed in the case of Derek Chauvin. But if we, as a community members, ever witness such an incident, what would you suggest we do?
Yeah, that can be a tricky situation, and totally agree. Never want to see anything like that ever happen again. I would offer that there's a couple pieces to that. One, you have to be careful about what you're walking into. And so if you witness something in action, chances are there were things that may have led up to that. So you have to be careful about maybe interceding or getting physical or things like that if that's a thought process in the back of somebody's head. I think the first thing that I would do is call 911 and get a supervisor notified and get on that phone and say, I'm seeing and I'm witnessing something here that's very tragic that I'm upset about, or whatever the case might be. And behind the scenes, that information in most departments will flow very easily and quickly to the supervisors working out on the street. And again, remember, city by city is a little bit different how they operate, but that is the number one thing that I would do, that I would recommend to get the ball rolling. If you're there for an extended period of time and the event is of longer duration, and you see it from beginning to end, and you're seeing things that are going wrong, getting involved physically on the front end, not something I recommend, because you can kind of get caught into a situation where you become, the problem in terms of just interfering with an arrest if you don't know the details. But if you see it from the beginning to the end and it gets to that point, what we witnessed, then I would make noise and get people involved and record. And we see that happening quite a bit. Get on the phone, go live on Facebook. There's all those tools that you can use. And, can you kind of, step in and get involved? That's not something I recommend unless it's an absolute necessary thing that you have to do. Certainly engage the officers that might be around as helping out as well. So there's a progression there. I just want to be careful in pointing out that everyone should just get involved from a physical standpoint, but kind of work through a progression and think about like that first step, calling that 911, get on your phone, because just about everyone has phones now, and get that ball rolling.
That's a great answer.
Thank you, Chief Milburn. Definitely keeping ourselves safe, and those who are trying to help be safe as well. But if something is going completely out of line, calling an officer or calling 911 and getting the supervisor out, recording, make noise, get other people involved. So then that way everybody can do their part in protecting and saving and guiding a situation that can potentially turn dangerous into something much safer. Thank you for that. All right, so I have another question here. So, let's see, let me make sure I'm getting this one right. So clarification, this one is for Chief Milburn. This one is for clarification on traffic stops. This person said, I thought we tracked traffic stops by race or non-white versus white. Are we?
If you're talking about the city of Edina, the answer is no at this point. If you're talking about the state and like through your driver's, if you get your driver's license, that data is not being tracked currently either. So it's dependent upon each department in the state to do that independently right now. There has been conversations about moving something like that forward at the state level. I couldn't speak to where that is right now, so we're just pushing forward for the city of Edina on that work.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Bravado. From your discussion, you have introduced the idea that people need to gain skills in addressing racism as perpetrators or victims. What skills do you think are needed?
Thank you for that question. The most important skills I think are needed is when we're looking at racism and healing processes, is that we should take personal responsibility. So one of the skills is what psychologists refer to as cognitive reframing. And that's when you choose to see something in a positive way, even if it's bad. So that means that if I see something happening around me that I'm afraid of or I'm upset, I can take that information, just like the chief was saying earlier, I can take that information forward as a learning experience for me and my community, as a way for me to share my knowledge and expertise as a witness. And the third thing I think that people can do is to actually focus on how such problems can be alleviated in the future. So when we talk to people in our community who are feeling like they are, kind of stuck, that there are ways out. So the skills of communication, listening, cognitive reframing, affect regulation, talking to yourself, and when you're getting upset, try to diffuse your own anger before you get involved with others. So all of these are skills that those who are perceived as perpetuating and those who are perceived as victims, the main thing is to learn to communicate, open your mouth, get help, talk it out, give yourself a chance to come to a more positive solution than something negative. Okay.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bravado. Remember, you can send your questions to hlee@edinamn.gov. Okay? We're still taking a few more questions. And these are all great questions. I'm so excited to hear all of the panelists' responses. And so this question is for Chief Milburn. At times, BIPOC community members feel that they have experienced racial bias in their interactions with police. What message do you want to give those communities about how you will demonstrate your commitment to undoing racism and promoting equity?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do recognize that there are many challenges out there and problems that continue to persist, right? Just things that were highlighted here today. It's important for us in law enforcement to try and move forward and also kind of put into play different opportunities where we can engage the community in a different way. I often say, what are we doing in law enforcement or in our daily work product when we're not answering 911 calls or out serving the community? It's in community engagement, right? And we have I'd say 70-80% of our time is focused on responding to those 911 calls. We're busy in the community, but when we do have this limited downtime, it needs to be pointed in this direction where we're building up this trust. And we know and we recognize right now it's been very difficult here across the board for the last couple of years, in particular here in this region. And so what are the things that we can do to be, restore and build and enhance that trust, not only for our department, but for all law enforcement agencies across the metro area? We're all having the similar conversations. And so we need to get together and continue this work and put it at a premium, quite honestly, and focus on that work moving forward. And so for us specifically in Edina, that's the mission ahead, is to continue to expand upon those engagement activities, officer Davis had talked to about getting into the high schools and coming up with some different strategies. And so those are like some examples, really good examples of that work that we're going to continue to enhance moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Chief Milburn. So to make sure that we're staying with time, we don't have any more questions for the panelists, but this was all wonderful conversation. Dr. Bravado explaining the timeline of racism within our society and how it has become ingrained within us, causing this ongoing persistent post-traumatic stress disorder for perpetrators and victims, even providing ways in which we can start to heal some of that trauma through cognitive reframing, sharing our knowledge and being witnesses and being able to focus on alleviating those stressors through affect regulation. And then switching over to Chief Milburn and understanding that there are policies and engagement and the ability to connect with community members to help undo the turbulent relationship between policing and people of color, and really having a commitment towards that. And also to Officer Davis's point of being able to recruit, having better recruitment, and being able to, once again, that engagement piece within our community and being able to share and understand the socioeconomic statuses and issues that may cause crime and how to reconcile and create mediation without punitive practices. So this was all great conversation, and I will hand this over to Mark Felton for closing remarks.
Wow, this was really impressive. Thank you, Dr. King. Well, this concludes our second conversation on race, justice, and policing. Now that you have seen the program, what questions or comments do you have now that you didn't have before you saw this program? Would you please take an anonymous survey and leave your questions and comments in the space provided? The web address to access the survey is at the bottom of your screen, or if you have a QRC reader, scan the code with your device to directly access the survey. Now, I have a quick announcement to make. The Human Rights and Relations Commission is accepting nominations now for the 2021 Tom Oy Human Rights Award. The award, named for the late Tom Oy, who helped found the Human Rights and Relations Commission, is given each year to an individual or group whose good work promotes human relations and advances human rights in Edina. For more information and a nomination form, please go to edinamn.gov/human rights or contact Heidi Lee at 952-826-1622. This event was recorded for rebroadcast on Edina TV and for replay on demand. The rebroadcast days and times are published on the city's website at edinamn.gov. Again, that's all I can say is, so on behalf of the Edina Human Rights and Relations Commission and the Planning Committee for this event, whose names are Heidi Lee, Joni Bennett, and Mamie Siegel, I extend a great thanks to our moderator, Dr. Aja King, our presenters, Dr. Bravado Garrett Akinsanya, Chief Todd Milburn, and Officer Darren Davis, and of course you, the audience, for listening in. Have a good evening, and thank you.